Sophie Turner hadn't been looking for love when she met Daniel Reed. At 23, she was fresh out of college, still finding her footing at her first full-time job, a mid-sized corporate office in downtown Cleveland. The world of spreadsheets, policy memos, and break room politics was new to her. Daniel, 27, was already a fixture there, an operations coordinator known for his calm, reliable nature. He was the person newer employees went to when the system crashed or deadlines piled up. He always had a solution, or at least a reassuring smile. Their connection started quietly, the way most lasting ones do. Daniel helped Sophie fill out her onboarding forms the first week. He explained procedures, showed her shortcuts on the system, even carried her laptop to a meeting when her arms were full of files. What began as polite small talk soon grew into shared coffee breaks, easy laughter in the copy room, and eventually long walks after work, where conversation flowed effortlessly. Daniel wasn't flashy. He didn't flirt like most of the men Sophie's age. He was composed, thoughtful, disciplined, and almost old-fashioned in his gentleness. He listened when she spoke. He noticed small details, like how she always added honey instead of sugar to her tea, or how she hummed when she concentrated. Within a year, they'd moved in together. Their apartment, a one-bedroom unit above a quiet street near the Cleveland Heights district, was small but warm. Sophie decorated with thrift store finds and framed photos from their weekend trips. Daniel liked order, shoes by the door, dishes stacked neatly, mornings that began with coffee and the news. They built little rituals together. Friday takeout nights, Sunday pancakes, and late-night drives to nowhere when neither could sleep. Their love was steady, uncomplicated, and for Sophie the safest thing she had ever known. There was, however, one curious detail about Daniel that everyone noticed sooner or later. He never drank alcohol. At company events, when the wine flowed freely, Daniel always declined. "I'm a boxer," he'd say with an easy grin. "Been training since I was 16. Alcohol messes with my focus." No one questioned it. His tone was matter-of-fact, not defensive, and Sophie admired that restraint. To her, it spoke of discipline, a trait she found quietly irresistible. As months passed, their relationship deepened. They shared playlists, recipes, plans for the future. Sophie often caught herself daydreaming about marriage. When Daniel proposed one chilly November evening at the edge of Lake Erie, the city lights glinting on the dark water, she said yes without hesitation. Sophie's parents, Margaret and Edward Turner, were thrilled when they heard the news. They had raised their only daughter on tradition. Dinners together, Christmas gatherings, summer trips to visit family in Akron. The idea of a wedding wasn't just about celebration, it was about continuity. So, a month after the engagement, Daniel and Sophie drove to the Turners' house for dinner. Margaret went all out, roasted chicken, creamy potatoes, and her famous lemon pie. Edward, a quiet man with a dry sense of humor, poured cider into crystal glasses and offered a toast to the young couple. Daniel charmed them effortlessly. He spoke politely, laughed at Edward's dry jokes, and complimented Margaret's cooking. He talked about his work, his love for early morning runs, and his dream of owning a small cabin near Lake Erie someday. But somewhere between dessert and coffee, Margaret asked, "So, Daniel, tell us about your family. Sophie hasn't said much." The question hung in the air like a sudden chill. Daniel froze, just for a fraction of a second, but Sophie noticed. His smile faltered, then returned, practiced and pleasant. "Oh, they're still in Ohio," he said lightly. "We don't see each other much. Different lives, I guess." He shifted the subject almost immediately, turning to Edward to ask about his logistics business. Margaret let it go, but a small unease crept into her chest. Why had Sophie never met his parents? Why did he never mention them? Later in the car, Sophie watched the dark road slide past and replayed the moment in her mind. Daniel's tone had been casual, but his eyes looked like someone guarding a door he refused to open. Winter melted slowly into March, and wedding talk began to fill the Turner house. Margaret adored every detail, the flowers, the dress, the first dance song. Edward pretended indifference, but Sophie caught him smiling whenever Margaret mentioned our daughter's big day. Daniel, though, seemed distant about it. One evening, while eating leftover pasta at their apartment, he said, "Sophie, what do you think about keeping the wedding small? Maybe just us and a few close friends. Something simple. Courthouse ceremony, dinner afterward. No crowds, no stress." Sophie blinked. "Small is fine," she said carefully. "But you mean no reception at all? Daniel shrugged. Why spend money on 100 people we barely know? We could use it for a honeymoon, or a down payment on a house. Something real. It was logical, even romantic in its practicality. Still, when Sophie told her parents, Margaret nearly dropped her teacup. No reception? Absolutely not, she exclaimed. Sweetheart, this is your wedding day. We've waited for this moment your whole life. If it's about cost, we'll help. But you deserve to be celebrated. Edward nodded, his voice calm but firm. It's not just about you two, Sophie. It's about both families coming together. Sophie stood caught between them, the man she loved and the family that had shaped her. She promised to discuss it again with Daniel. The next weekend, as they folded laundry, she tried. My parents really want a bigger ceremony, she said gently. They even offered to pay. It means a lot to them. Daniel's hand stilled mid-fold. He set down a shirt and exhaled. Sophie, my parents won't be there. The words hit her like a cold wind. What do you mean? We haven't even sent invitations. He turned away. It doesn't matter. They won't come. That's just how it is. But why? Don't you at least want to try? His jaw tightened. It's not possible. They're busy. Busy. That was all he offered. Sophie bit back frustration, sensing that pushing harder would only build another wall. But that night, lying beside him while the radiator hummed softly, she stared at the ceiling, wondering, who were these people he refused to speak of? Why hadn't she ever heard a single phone call, seen a photo, heard even a story from his childhood? The more she thought about it, the more the silence felt deliberate. She told herself to be patient. He'd open up when he was ready. Still, the question gnawed at her. And then, one cold morning in February, Daniel said he had to leave for a short business trip, 2 days in Youngstown. Nothing unusual. His job sometimes required travel. He kissed her forehead before dawn and left with a small suitcase. Sophie watched from the window as his taxi disappeared into the gray street. Her breath clouded the glass. She'd already made her decision. That evening, while tidying up, she opened the glove box of his car to grab a pen and froze. Inside lay a folded envelope addressed in neat handwriting. To Linda Reed, Youngstown, Ohio. Her pulse quickened. Linda Reed. She remembered Daniel mentioning his mother's first name once, quickly, by accident. She hesitated, then slipped the envelope into her purse. The next morning, with a heart full of guilt and curiosity, she packed a small bag, told her parents she'd be out of town for errands, and set her GPS for Youngstown. As the city skyline faded in the rearview mirror, the road stretched ahead, long, gray, and full of questions she was finally ready to answer. The drive from Cleveland to Youngstown felt longer than the miles suggested. The winter sky hung low, a dull sheet of gray pressing against the horizon. The hum of the tires on cracked asphalt became a kind of rhythm, steady, hypnotic, filled with unspoken dread. Sophie gripped the wheel, her mind chasing thoughts she wasn't ready to face. She told herself this wasn't snooping, it was understanding. You couldn't marry a man whose past was built on silence. You couldn't build a life on unanswered questions. Yet, guilt clung to her anyway, an invisible fog heavier than the snow gathering on the road's shoulders. As the miles passed, Cleveland's clean symmetry faded into the rougher sprawl of the Rust Belt. Warehouses, half collapsed, stood like tired sentinels along the highway, graffiti scrawled across steel doors. The wind carried the faint tang of old industry, iron, oil, and something forgotten. When the GPS finally announced she was approaching destination, Sophie slowed the car and turned down a narrow street that looked half abandoned. Potholes scarred the pavement, mailboxes leaned drunkenly. Houses sagged under the weight of time, their porches warped and roofs patched with mismatched shingles. The address on the envelope appeared on a cracked mailbox at the edge of a small, battered house. The number was painted unevenly, half-faded. A rusted truck sat on the lawn, its tires flat and frames streaked with rust. A dog barked somewhere nearby, a hoarse, territorial sound. Sophie parked, cut the engine, and sat still. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was Daniel's home, or had been. She climbed out slowly, the wind biting at her face, and stepped onto the creaking porch. The boards moaned under her boots. A sour smell, a mix of liquor, rot, and unwashed air, drifted through the cracks of the door. She hesitated, hand hovering over the knocker. Then she knocked. At first, silence. Then the shuffling of feet, a muttered curse, the clink of glass. The door opened an inch, then wider. The woman standing there looked older than her years, 50 maybe, though life had carved its own lines deeper than time ever could. Her gray-blonde hair hung in tangles, her eyes bloodshot, rimmed with sleeplessness. A thin bathrobe clung loosely to her frame, stained with something that might have once been coffee or wine. "What?" the woman snapped, voice rough. "If you're from the electric company, I told you already. Shut it off. See if I care." She swayed slightly, a half-empty bottle of vodka dangling from her hand. Sophie swallowed, forcing her voice steady. "I'm looking for Linda Reed." "You found her," the woman said, squinting. "Who wants to know?" Before Sophie could answer, a small, clear voice cut through the gloom behind her. "Mom, stop yelling at people." A girl appeared in the hallway, 12, maybe 13, thin, sharp-eyed, with light brown hair pulled into a careless ponytail. Despite her small frame, there was a confidence in her stance, a spark of defiance that didn't belong to childhood. "Go back to your room, Ava," Linda barked, not taking her eyes off Sophie. Ava crossed her arms. "You're just gonna ask her for money like you always do." "Don't start," Linda hissed. "You sold my jacket, Mom," Ava shot back. "The one Daniel sent me for Christmas. You sold it for booze. You sell everything." Sophie froze. The world tilted for a moment, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. "Daniel." Linda's lips twitched. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do." Ava's voice cracked, but her glare didn't waver. "You ruined everything. You ruined him. That's why he doesn't come back here. That's why he hates you." The room went silent except for the soft hum of a television somewhere in the house. Linda's face hardened. "Shut up." "No," Ava whispered, tears glinting but refusing to fall. "You don't get to talk about him like you still have a son." Then, turning to Sophie with trembling hands, the girl said quietly, "You should leave. She's drunk. She'll start throwing things soon." Sophie wanted to speak, to ask, to understand, but her throat was dry. She looked at Linda, this wreck of a woman, and tried to reconcile her with the image of the disciplined, calm man she knew. "Who are you?" Linda demanded, stepping forward. Sophie hesitated. "I'm a friend of Daniel's." At the name, Linda's expression shifted. Not warmth, but something sour, almost fearful. "He doesn't have friends," she said. "Not anymore. He has his job and his pride and his pretty lies." Sophie's breath caught. "Pretty lies?" Linda laughed, a sound both bitter and broken. "You think you know him? You don't know what he's capable of." "Mom," Ava warned softly, but Linda kept talking, the words spilling now, slurred but sharp. "He left us years ago. Left me to rot in this house. Thought he was too good for where he came from. Oh, but he wasn't always that calm, perfect boy, no. He was just like his father when he got angry." Her eyes gleamed as she took another swig. "Ask him about the night the police came. Ask him what really happened to his brother." "Mom!" Ava shouted, voice shaking. "Stop it!" But Linda had turned away, muttering to herself, retreating deeper into the dim hallway. Sophie stood rooted to the porch, her body cold, her pulse roaring. Brother, police. The words twisted in her mind like a puzzle missing its last piece. Then Ava stepped closer, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't believe her when she's like this. She drinks and says things that aren't true." "But," she hesitated, eyes darting toward the dark hall, "not everything she says is a lie." Before Sophie could respond, Linda yelled something unintelligible, the crash of a bottle following. Ava flinched. "Go!" the girl whispered urgently. "You shouldn't be here." Sophie nodded slowly and stepped backward down the stairs. The door slammed behind her, the sound echoing through the empty street. She stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, watching her own fogged breath drift into the cold air. Through a cracked window, she saw Ava's small figure retreating down the hallway, head lowered, shoulders tense. That image stayed with her long after she got into her car. Sophie didn't drive far. Instead, she parked at a rundown convenience store a few blocks away and sat for nearly 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel. The adrenaline hadn't faded, neither had the ache in her chest. Then, through the windshield, she saw movement. a familiar ponytail bobbing across the street. Ava. The girl was walking fast, hands shoved into her pockets, shoulders hunched against the cold. She turned down a narrow path toward what looked like a small lake behind the neighborhood. Sophie's instinct flared. She couldn't just leave the girl alone. She got out of the car, ducked into the store, and bought a few things: a packet of cookies, bottled water, and a candy bar. The man at the counter barely looked up as he rang her up. When she stepped outside, Ava was standing near the edge of the lot, staring at her suspiciously. "Why are you following me?" the girl demanded. "I'm not," Sophie said gently, holding up the bag. "I just thought you might want something to eat." Ava frowned but didn't move away. After a moment, she muttered, "I'm not going back home yet." "That's fine," Sophie said quietly. "Can I walk with you?" The girl hesitated, then shrugged. "Whatever, just don't talk too much." They walked together along the dirt path, the ground uneven beneath their feet. The lake came into view, half frozen, rimmed by skeletal trees. The air was sharp with the smell of wet leaves and iron. Ava sat on an overturned log, tearing open the cookies. Sophie stood a few feet away, letting her eat in silence. After a few minutes, Ava spoke without looking up. "He told me never to tell anyone about this place. Said it was just for us." Sophie's breath caught. "Daniel?" Ava nodded. "He used to bring me here when I was little, before everything." "Before what?" Sophie asked softly. Ava chewed another cookie, eyes on the water. "Before he stopped coming home. Before Dad died." Sophie's pulse quickened. "Your dad?" Ava's voice dropped lower. "He wasn't nice. He hurt Mom a lot. Sometimes he hurt Daniel too. One night, it got really bad. Daniel fought back." She paused, staring into the frozen lake. "After that, Dad was gone. Everyone said he left, but Daniel never talked about it again." Sophie's stomach twisted. "Did the police?" Ava cut her off. "Mom says Daniel was protecting us. That's why she forgave him. But she also says he ruined everything. I don't know which part is true." The wind whipped across the lake, scattering brittle leaves. Sophie felt her knees weaken. This was what Daniel had been hiding. Not shame, but trauma. A past buried so deep it had poisoned every part of his life, and yet something still didn't fit. If he'd protected them, why the guilt in his eyes every time she mentioned family? Why the silence so thick it suffocated him? She didn't have the answers. Not yet. But she knew one thing. The man she loved was built on secrets that could destroy them both. Ava looked up, her expression fragile but fierce. "You really care about him, don't you?" Sophie nodded slowly. "Yes, more than he knows." "Then make him tell you the truth," Ava said, standing. "Because if you don't, someone else will, and you might not like how they do it." The words lingered long after the girl walked away, her small frame swallowed by the gray horizon. Sophie stood alone by the water, the wind biting, her heart heavier than ever. The reflection of the clouds on the frozen lake looked fractured, like everything she thought she knew about Daniel Reed. Sophie drove back to Cleveland with the heater humming and the sky turning the color of old pewter. The miles unspooled, but the conversation by the frozen lake replayed in loops. Ava's steady voice, Linda's slurred accusations, the way the word brother had cracked through the air like glass. Daniel's silence had always felt like a locked door. Now she could hear what lived behind it: fear, and something heavier than fear: shame. She parked, sat in the quiet for a long minute, then climbed the stairwell to their apartment with legs that felt foreign. The place smelled like rosemary and lemon, Daniel's idea of a clean slate after a long week. She found him at the table with unmarked spreadsheets piled in neat stacks, a habit he fell into when he needed control. He looked up, and in the instant before he smiled, she saw the flicker of calculation, as if weighing which version of himself she was ready for. "You're back early," he said. "Everything okay?" "Tell me the truth," Sophie said. Something in his face stilled. He set down his pen and folded his hands. "What truth?" "About your family, about Youngstown, about your father." She swallowed. "About why you never drink? Why you never talk about home? Why your parents aren't coming to our wedding? I went there, Daniel. I met your mother." He didn't flinch at mother. He flinched at went. Then his features arranged themselves into something patient, resigned. She was drunk. Yes. And she said things. His mouth twitched at one corner, not a smile, not a smirk, more like a wince. What did she say? She said to ask you what happened the night the police came. Sophie leaned forward, palms flat on the table. And your sister, Ava, said you were protecting them, that your father hurt your mother, that you fought back. She thinks he left. Did he? Daniel pressed his thumb to the inside of his wrist, counting seconds the way he did to steady his breathing. He didn't look at her when he answered. No. The radiator clicked once. The streetlight outside buzzed and steadied. Then where is he? Dead, he said quietly. He's dead. The word didn't echo. It sank. Sophie sat, slow, because her knees had turned to water. I was 19, Daniel said. Ava was 8. He came home drunk and mean, worse than usual. It wasn't new. The yelling, the slamming doors, the way the house felt like it shrank under his voice. That night he threw a bottle. It missed my mom by inches. I grabbed him. He swung at me. I hit back. He closed his eyes. He fell. Hit his head on the edge of the coffee table. He wasn't breathing. I tried to wake him up. Sophie reached for his hand, but he drew in a breath and kept going. I called 911. They came. They saw the bruise on my mom's cheek, the blood on the table, the empty bottle. One of the officers said it was self-defense. Another followed me onto the porch and told me to keep my mouth shut if I didn't want my little sister in foster care while they figured things out. And your mother? Sophie asked. She told them he fell. They wrote it up as accidental, fall while intoxicated. He gave a hollow laugh. He'd done enough to make that plausible. Sophie pictured the warped porch, the stained robe, the yellowed curtains. And after? After I worked, he said, voice flat. 2 jobs, any job, paid whatever bills I could. But my mother, he let the sentence trail off. There's a hunger that's more than thirst. It eats the house from the inside. His hands had stilled. They were the hands of a boxer when the bell stops ringing. Open, trembling just a little, Sophie covered them with her own. You didn't do anything wrong, she said. He let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in his chest for years. That's not how it felt when she started telling neighbors a different story. That I'd killed my father. She only did it when she needed something. A ride, cash, sympathy. Drunk endings always rewrite themselves, so the light falls a little kinder on whoever's telling it. Is that why you left? I left, he said, because leaving was the only thing that didn't make it worse. For her, for Ava, for me. They were quiet a while. Outside, a bus sighed at the curb. Somewhere, a neighbor laughed too loudly at a sitcom punchline. It sounded so normal that Sophie wanted to break something just to hear it shatter. I met Ava, she said. She's fierce, smart. She thinks you're a hero. She also thinks you're a ghost. He closed his eyes. I send money straight to a card she can access. School supplies, clothes, it's never enough. It's also the only thing that doesn't turn into vodka before it hits the kitchen table. Sophie nodded, and then gently, because the question had settled like sediment in her chest. Is that why you wanted a small wedding? Because your mother would come if there were an open bar and an audience? Because you didn't know how to keep that world from colliding with this one? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was in the way he stared at the tabletop, as if a knot had formed there that he could undo with his eyes. Okay, Sophie said. Then we choose the size of our life, not the size of our guest list. He looked up, startled by the softness in her voice. You're not leaving. Daniel, she said, almost laughing, because the idea was so far from her it looked like a different language. I drove to Youngstown. If I was going to run, I would have kept driving until the lake ran out of names. He exhaled a sound between a laugh and a sob, then scrubbed his hands over his face. I wish I could give you a clean story, a clean family. I wish I wasn't made of rooms with the lights switched off. I don't need your rooms to be clean, she said. I just need to know which ones are locked and where you keep the key. That night, they didn't talk about receptions or floral arrangements. They lay awake with the lamp off and the blinds half open, watching the city stitch itself into a quieter shape. Somewhere after 2, Daniel said, There's one more thing. Sophie propped herself on an elbow. Okay. My mother hasn't spoken to me in a while, he said. But someone at work, the assistant controller, he pulled me into a meeting last week and mentioned Youngstown. Laughed about Rust Belt skeletons. It felt pointed. Sophie's thoughts clicked, slow and reluctant. You think she contacted someone? If she needs money, he said, she sells proximity, sometimes to men, sometimes to anyone who looks like they can pay for a story. Who at work? Victor Ames, Daniel said. He's not my direct boss, but he's close to the CFO. And he's the kind of man who thinks secrets are currency. Sophie sat up fully now. Why would he want to use yours? Because I've been blocking a contract, Daniel said. It's padded. Inflated invoices to a vendor that doesn't exist anywhere except an LLC mailbox. I raised it in a meeting. He smiled like a shark and told me to be a team player. 2 days later, he asked me how my quaint Youngstown clan was doing. Sophie's scalp prickled. So if you sign off, your past stays buried. If you don't, he digs. That's the shape of it. Then we don't let him hold the shovel, she said. He gave a thin smile, surprised. We? If he's going to weaponize your story, she said, then we choose where the first blow lands. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her like she was saying the most dangerous, beautiful thing. You really would do that. I drove to your mother's porch, she said. I can sit in a boardroom. Careful, he murmured. You're starting to sound like me. I'm starting to sound like us. A plan is just courage with instructions, and in the morning she wrote the instructions. Step 1, proof. You don't accuse a man like Victor Ames with smoke. You bring the fire. Daniel sent a polite request for documentation to accounts payable, then a less polite one to procurement. Sophie, meanwhile, called her father. Edward Turner had built his logistics business on knowing which pallets showed up and which didn't. He understood the language of invoices, the way poets understood breath. I need you to look at some purchase orders, she said. Everything okay, kiddo? Not yet, she said. But it will be. He came by that evening, his usual calm like ballast in the room. They ate soup Sophie ladled from the stove and spread printouts across the table. Edward's eyes thinned as he read. Dummy vendor, he said after 10 minutes. Bills for rush shipments that would have required capacity we don't have. No carrier named, no bill of lading. And these emails? Whoever wrote them tried to sound logistical and landed on word salad. He tapped a corner with his finger. Where did these originate? Assistant Controller's office, Daniel said, under Victor's purview. Edward nodded slowly. You bring this to your CFO, and you bring it with 2 things, a timeline and a witness. Preferably someone who doesn't need this job to eat. Dad, Sophie said, what if the CFO is part of it? Then you bring it to legal, he said. And if legal is asleep, you wake them with copies to an attorney who wakes up angry. He regarded Daniel, something fatherly and flinty settling into his expression. And you document everything. Assume every room has an ear. After he left, Sophie sat with Daniel in the warm hum of the apartment and made a list of every whisper of threat Victor had made. Then she added a second list, every time Daniel had chosen silence to protect someone else. This time, she said, pen tapping the page, you protect yourself. And you, he said, and Ava, she returned. He nodded once. The confrontation came sooner than they expected. 2 days later, Victor intercepted Daniel in the stairwell, the space where men who liked the aesthetics of intimidation went to practice them without witnesses. Read, Victor said, friendly as a dentist. Got a minute? Daniel kept his face bland. Of course. Victor glanced around. You're an asset here, you know. We want to keep you unencumbered. He made a small, sympathetic face. Hard to do that when people are whispering about your past? What people? Daniel asked, as if the question were about weather. Victor smiled without his eyes. You know how it is. Rust Belt towns, lots of stories. Hard to tell which ones are true. Harder, Daniel said, when the storyteller is drunk. For a flicker, something mean moved in Victor's gaze. Then it smoothed. Sign the amendments, Daniel. This place could love you. All you have to do is love it back. You mean love you back, Daniel said softly. You and whatever shell company you married our vendor file to. Victor's smile sharpened. Careful. Sophie watched the footage later, grainy, shot from the tiny body cam pin Daniel fastened to his lapel that morning after they decided courage needed a recorder. Victor didn't say the word blackmail. Blackmailers never do. But the whole conversation was a kind of choreography, and every step landed where a prosecutor could see it. By afternoon, the packet Sophie had compiled, invoices, Edward's memo, Daniel's email trail, and a transcription of Victor's beautiful, damning politeness, sat in the inboxes of the CFO, general counsel, and 2 outside attorneys known for treating numbers like crime scenes. A clean copy went to internal audit. Another, held in reserve, went to a journalist who owed Edward a favor and knew how to file a records request without tipping a hand. At 4, the CFO requested a meeting. At 4:10, legal joined. At 4:10, legal joined. At 4:20, Victor was asked, in the kind of HR voice reserved for men who don't yet know they're done, to wait in a conference room. Sophie wasn't in the building. She was in a car across the street, phone in her lap, the lake of Cleveland winter sky reflecting off the windshield. Daniel texted exactly once. It's happening. When he came out an hour later, his shoulders were set in a line she hadn't seen since the night he told her the word dead. It wasn't burden, it was relief disguised as posture. They suspended him, he said at the curb, voice low and steady. Audit takes it from here. Legal copied outside counsel. The CFO pretended he was shocked. Maybe he was. Or maybe he's good at pretending. Doesn't matter. The contract is frozen and the files are sealed pending the investigation. And your mother? Sophie asked. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm going to call her, not to beg, not to explain. Just to set a boundary like a fence around a child. Then I'm going to call Ava. He did both that night. Linda answered on the 3rd ring, voice bright, as if she'd been expecting good news from a bad habit. When Daniel said, "Do not contact anyone where I work. Do not contact Sophie. If you need money, go to the county office. Give them my number. I will arrange groceries delivered to the house under Ava's name." Linda turned mean, then wept, then hung up. Sophie watched him breathe through each stage like a boxer letting a flurry of punches find empty air. Ava answered on the 1st ring. Is it true? She blurted before hello. Mom said you called and you were... It's true that I called, Daniel said gently. It's true that I love you. It's true that I'm going to make sure you have what you need for school, and it's true that when you're ready for college or whatever you choose, we'll fill out the forms together, and we'll go look at campuses you've only seen on TV. The rest of what she said, you don't have to carry it. There was a long silence, then a small, wrecked sound. Okay. Do you still go to the lake? He asked. Sometimes, she whispered. Wait for spring, he said. Water is patient. Be like that. When he hung up, Sophie folded him into her arms and felt the shape of the man he was without armor. Frightened, brave, both at once. Spring came like a rumor that turned into a headline. Audit concluded what they had known. The vendor was smoke with a bank account. The invoices were paper kites caught in a wind of arrogance. Victor had been author, editor, and evangelist. He resigned before the word terminated could make it to the letterhead. 2 months later, he was indicted, and the company sent an email with a subject line so passive it could have been a nap. Update on procurement review. The body was sharper. It thanked Daniel by name for upholding our standards. It CC'd the world. The same morning, a text pinged Daniel's phone from an unknown number. Unknown. Call me. We can make this go away. Daniel, who is this? Unknown. Your mother's friend. She said you were reasonable. He looked at Sophie and they both started laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind you make when a storm finally decides to rain somewhere else. He blocked the number. They met Sophie's parents that night for dinner. Margaret watched Daniel with careful eyes that saw more than he wished and judged less than he feared. Small wedding, Margaret said, pouring more tea. We'll keep it small if that's what you want. A celebration is not measured in chairs. Edward nodded. And if anyone arrives who shouldn't, I will become a very boring man who talks about forklifts until they leave. Daniel's mouth tugged into something like gratitude, trying to stand up and not quite knowing how. Sophie reached under the table and squeezed his hand. We'll do a ceremony by the lake, she said. The Cleveland one, not the Youngstown one. Morning light, no open bar, pancakes afterward. Pancakes, Margaret said decisively, are an underused wedding food. They set the date for late May, when the trees shake off their modesty and Cleveland remembers it can be beautiful. On the morning of their wedding, Sophie woke to sunlight stretching gold across the bedroom floor. The city was soft, the kind of quiet that happens not because the world stops, but because everyone chooses to walk gently for a minute. Her dress was simple, silk that moved like memory. Daniel wore a suit the color of smoke and looked like a man who had finally found a room he wanted to live in. Margaret cried the way mothers cry when they see all the years at once. Edward straightened Daniel's tie with the solemnity of a man refueling an airplane. They stood at the edge of the lake with a handful of people, family, friends, and the officiant asked them to tell the truth aloud. Not the whole truth. Just the piece of it you promised to protect with your life. I used to think love was safety, Sophie said, voice clear in the wind. But love is a choice you make in a room with all the lights on. Daniel's mouth shook. I used to think silence was strength, he said. But strength is telling the person you love which doors are locked and handing them the key. They exchanged rings. The wind riffled the water into an applause of small hands. At the brunch, someone suggested a toast. Daniel lifted his glass of sparkling cider and felt for the first time no tug of apology where the wine would be. To choosing your life on purpose, he said. To work that doesn't ask for your soul as collateral. To family, the kind you're given and the kind you build. They ate pancakes with strawberries. They laughed so hard Margaret had to dab at her eyes twice. Edward told a story about a pallet that went to Detroit by accident and came back with a better personality. The day felt like a door that opened onto a hallway with light at both ends. In the late afternoon, when the guests were gone and the apartment had that after-party calm that smells like flowers and dish soap, Sophie and Daniel sat on the floor between the couch and the coffee table, the very place where his story bent once and then bent back toward itself. Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder. What about Ava? She asked. I called the school counselor, he said. Asked her to loop me in whenever there's a form or a fee. We'll take her to see a campus this summer. If she wants to major in anything but survival, I'll call it a victory. And your mother? He was quiet for a moment. There's a difference, he said at last, between forgiveness and permission. I can forgive what the drink turned her into. I don't have to permit it to turn me into anything. Sophie kissed his temple. Boundaries, she murmured. Look at us, practically adults. He laughed into her hair. You picked me. That's the most adult thing anyone's ever done. They stayed there until the light shifted and the walls turned the color of late honey. When they finally rose, it was not to pack for a honeymoon they couldn't afford yet, or to post photos with captions that sounded like promises auditioning for permanence, but to do the small, real things, toss the wilting flowers, fold the linen napkins Margaret insisted on bringing, write a note to Ava with a photo of the lake. Later, Sophie sat with her laptop and opened a blank document. At the top she typed, Turner Reed Foundation, draft. It was an idea she'd been stitching quietly for weeks. Small grants for emergency relocation for kids like Ava, partnerships with shelters, a hotline staffed by people who spoke in verbs, not platitudes. Daniel came up behind her reading. You don't do anything halfway, he said. Neither do you, she answered. He placed his hands on her shoulders, warm, anchored. We'll build it, he said. We'll build a lot of things, she replied. Outside, the city breathed. Somewhere, sirens. Somewhere else, a baby laughed. The world's noise didn't stop. It just made room. And in a small apartment above a quiet street, two people sat at a kitchen table with a stack of papers and a plan, finally understanding that revenge wasn't always about breaking what hurt you. Sometimes it was about building the thing that would outlast it.